Okay, we're back. This is part 2 of lesson number 10 of 9 for rapid application development, COMP1004. Okay, so we've successfully downloaded and installed .Kinet Express for MySQL. And we're going to get back into, now we're going to go right into databasing, but before we do that, just to make sure that you have it installed correctly in your Visual Studio after you've rebooted Visual Studio, you should see on the top where it says Tools, a MySQL selection in your menu here. If you don't see that, then it's not installed properly. That's a problem. Okay. Let us go back. So we're talking about databases today, and again, I apologize in advance because we've done a little bit of a survey today too, and everything else, and no time to take a break so far. So again, we do a lot of stuff with relational databases, and as I said, we're not going to cover everything about them. We're just going to connect to them today. So with CSharp in databases, we're going to use ADO.NET. Previously to that, it was called something else. But what ADO.NET does is it uses XML to connect to your database source. It allows you to connect to different sources. For example, an Access database, or a SQL server, Microsoft's SQL server, or an Oracle database server, or DB2, or whatever that you're connecting to. So Visual Studio has that flexibility, and depending on the database platform you'll be using, it has tools that either you can download, like we just did, right, or that are built in. In this class, we'll be using MySQL Server, which we just configured, which is again a tie-in for the other class that you're doing with advanced web programming. So some basic database terminology. A database file, again, the .mdf extension means it's a SQL database file that's been detached from the SQL database itself. Or it's a backup. You can use that. A .mdb file, which is your Access database, you might see that. Or the .sql extension file, which is your SQL script file for MySQL. Okay? So those are different kinds of files it can connect to. And it can also connect to text files, too. Right? There's any data, you can target any other data source that you want. So it has that kind of flexibility. If you're building a mobile application, as an example, there's other types of SQL servers you can connect to that are local to the database. So they're local to the device. Okay. So databases have multiple tables, as you guys know, and usually one table is related to another table. Today, and for our examples, we're going to be using one table, right? Because again, we're not talking databases. We're not showing you advanced database stuff. We're only showing you how to connect to a database. Here's a database example. We have different columns and fields and so on, rows, just to refresh your memory if you haven't seen a database in a long time, which I doubt for programmers. But let's just say you haven't. Here's what it is: your record or row, and then your field or column. So it's records and fields, is usually what it's called. Again, XML data. If you don't know, who does not know anything about XML? Please don't say, really? If you haven't taken a look at XML, or if you're not familiar with XML, I would be a self-starter and figure out how it works. We're going to cover a little bit of it. I want to try and cover it next week a little bit as well, and describe what XML is. It uses a series of tags to describe fields and data for any kind of data that you use. Sorry? It is pretty straightforward. It's used a lot by Android development. If you're doing any kind of mobile development with Android, it's fully XML based, and a lot of other development environments. For example, if you're creating a graphic user interface, XML in many other development environments is used to describe the graphic user interface to the system. Right? So say, well, I got this button. Okay, that's the name of the control. And underneath there, here's my coordinates with XML and so on. It describes all that, and then the OS or your development environment takes that information and translates it into code for you, so it creates your UI, right? So there's a lot of that going on with XML. The other thing that I would recommend that you learn as a format for storing and transferring data would be JSON. Okay, so if you don't know those two formats, I think you're in a disadvantageous position if you're a web programmer or even a programmer of any kind. Okay. So let's talk about ADO.NET and CSharp. Okay. Again, I'm just mentioning here we're going to cover how it connects to Windows forms. We're not going to be covering web forms. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to add controls to the form and bind data to them. So we're going to add, example, labels, text boxes, and specialized controls like they're called the data grid view and the data list, which are required for assignment number 4. Okay, so here's your example data grid view, what it looks like, right? So the data grid view control is bound to a table in a data set, right? And the data fields display automatically in the cells of the grid. So what happens is your title, your author name, and your publisher, those are your columns, and then each of the rows are displayed in the data grid view. Okay, so how do we set that up? We're going to talk about that in a bit. We're going to actually do a little example together, right? So I know some of you are dying, you need more coffee, and we're going to take a bit of a break, even though we don't have a lot of time, but we will anyway. So the great thing about Visual Studio, this environment, it's a drag and drop environment. And what you can do is you can take the data grid view control and drag it onto your form, and then it'll start off, hey, how do I connect my data source and so on. When you have a data-bound control, you need to have a couple things. You need to have this XSD file, which is your schema file, which, by the way, you've seen in other database kind of programs. It'll show you the actual database itself, the different fields, IDs, and so on. And in a relational database environment, you'll see links from one of these schema files to another. You're also going to have a couple of components in the tray: a binding source, a table adapter, and a data set. So those are new components we haven't seen before, and they're automatically generated for you when we create a connection to the database. So here's what they are: a binding source. It's the link to the data. The table adapter, and by the way, the table adapter, whether you're doing Java or whether you're doing Objective-C or whatever, you need some kind of table adapter usually to connect to the database, right? In Java, you have a database adapter class that you're going to be using. Here in CSharp, it's all handled for you. So it actually throws in all the namespaces that you need when you use a connection to the database, and it creates this table adapter that can handle the data, right? And what table adapter does is it automatically creates these SQL statements, these query statements, so that you can get data from the database. And the data set itself is almost like a collection of data that's taken in from the database, right? So here's your binding source, your link, your table adapter, SQL statements, the data set is all your data. That's where it's all housed, and it's usually done in memory, right? When your actual application is loaded. Your binding navigator is one other thing that you use, and that's if you want to navigate. Sometimes you can add this binding navigator to navigate through the data, right? So, for example, if you want to step through next, and step through the next fields and so on, there's also this other control that you can attach to your data, which we'll also see in this section. So here's an example of what it looks like. You've got your database source or data source. In our case, we're going to actually, instead of a data file, we're actually going to use a live source or MySQL server, right? Your binding source or your binding source object, your table adapter, goes to your data set, and from there you can actually either have a web form or Windows form to display the data, or, and this is the other thing, is if you want to use open source tools to actually access the data as well, it's live data on the server, right? In this particular case. And we've kind of covered this, so I'm going to skip this part, and some of you are glazing. All right, so how do we do that? Let's do this step by step. This will get you guys going. And you need to do this, guys, with me. For those of you who are watching the video, I recommend highly that you do this with me here. If you don't, there are certain steps you'll miss. And when it comes to assignment number 4, you will scream and you'll say, Tom, I don't know what I'm doing. I can't get this data connection to work. Okay, let's do this together. So we start a new project. And just like we normally start all new projects, we're going to go File, New Project. Right, there it is. And for this lesson, I'll call it Lesson 10, and we'll say DB or MySQL, demo. Right, that's what I'll call it, just to make it unique for me. And here it is. I got this form. What I want to do when I have the form started off is I want to resize the form. Right, so I want to house my data grid view. Data grid views are going to show everything in this as much as I can anyway here in my form, right? To have a proper data grid view, and you're going to see in a second, I want to make it so that the form itself is going to be able to show the fields. Otherwise, if I have too many scroll bars, it's not a useful control, as you'll see. That's the first thing I want to do. So I want to call this thing Books Form, right? And I want to set the text property to R&R Books. So let's follow this example. And if you can follow it online with me here, or if you download the PDFs from Blackboard, you can do it there as well. So Books Form and R&R Books. Okay, so here it is, Books Form. And again, we're doing this again and again over and over again, so people online can see this stuff. Sometimes it requires a couple of viewings for this to happen. So here's Books Form. And again, under the form itself, I want to call it R&R Books. So here's my text, R&R, Books. There it is. And I want to save all. Okay. And now what I want to do is I'm going to add a data grid view, right, to that control to the form and spread it out so it takes up most of my form. Okay. So let's go back. So if I want to find data grid view, there's a couple ways to do it. I can use my all Windows forms control. I can go down here and find data grid view. It's all alphabetized, right? Or it's also sectioned off here under data, which is the other section that you can find. So I'm going to close these containers up here. And under data, you'll see your data grid view. That's fine too. So you drag and drop that onto the form. You can use the smart arrows to connect it. Now, at the beginning, you're going to see this choose data source, right? As an example, right? So if I don't have a data source, right, I'm going to have to add a project to the data source. That's the next step. Let's see if I'm right. If I go back to the PowerPoint presentation, right? I was pretty sure that's what I had to do. So let's go back. So if I add project data source, it's going to pull up this little file that says database. Right? I can actually connect it to a web service if I want, another object, a SharePoint site. There's other options here, which is actually quite cool, right? So you can connect to different sources. Let's go next. I want a data set. That's where I want to house my data, right? That's the model, right? When we talk model view controller in advanced web programming, this is the model that we're going to use to access the data, right? There's also the entity data model, which we're not going to do. I can highlight it, but we're going to use the data set model. Then click Next. Now it's going to ask you to say, hey, which data connection should your application use to connect to the database, right? Well, if you notice, if I pull this down, there's nothing there. I've got to create my new connection, right? So I'm going to click New Connection. And automatically it's going to say, hey, my Microsoft Access database file or something else. I don't want that. I want MySQL Server. Now, let's pause here for a second. If you haven't installed your ODBC driver in Windows 7, okay, or if you haven't installed your .Connect Express properly, you will not see this option. You'll have a problem. You'll say, if you don't see this here, and if you haven't seen it under the Tools menu, if you haven't seen MySQL, something's gone wrong with your install, and you're going to have to go back. For us, though, everything seems fine, and I'm going to click MySQL Server and click OK. No, it's okay. I mean, if you're always using a MySQL Server, yes, but in your case, you might be making an assignment number 4 may not use a MySQL connection, right? Because I don't have your database, right? You're going to be making your own file or using a file I've already given to you on Blackboard, okay? So the host, of course, is localhost, right? So we can just type that in. We're going to use port 3306 because that's a standard MySQL port. But let's suppose you had a non-standard port that you were using for MySQL Server, then you change this port to something else. Your user ID is the user that we created recently, just now in PHPMyAdmin. I created a user called John, and my password I put in was PA55 word, password with 5s instead of S's, which is fine. So if I've done this properly, once I've done this part, okay, without clicking database, if I scroll down here, it should show my database. That means I already have a connection to my database. If you can't do this, something's wrong. Okay? Okay? So even without actually choosing my database, I should be able to connect to my SQL server right now, and it shows me on PHPMyAdmin, it'll connect me the way we've done it, and it'll show me the list of databases. Okay? I'm going to click and choose R&R Books for our example here today. Once I've done that, another good idea is to actually click on this test connection button here on the bottom left. If I test connection, it should show me this test connection succeeded alert box or message box should come up, right? If that doesn't come up, something's wrong, right? Now I'm going to press OK. It's going to ask me, do I want to include sensitive data in the connection string? For our purposes, I'm going to say yes. In another environment, you may want to say no, because you may not want to be sending that kind of information over the air, if you will, right? We're going to say yes, and we're going to click next. And then it's going to say, do you want to save the connection string to the application configuration file? You're going to say yes, and it's going to suggest a string for you, R&R Books connection string. It's okay to accept this. This is a good, valid, and contextual variable name or object name. Click next. Now, at this stage, it's going to give you some tables, right? All we care about, we're going to go through here, all we care about is the books table, right? So, and if you specify, you can actually specify which fields or that you want to be available to you in the books table. I want them all, so I'm going to click this top checkbox, right? And if you notice, the data set name is this is where you can change it down here, where it says data set name. If you want to customize your data set name here, you can do so. I think R&R Books data set is fine for our purposes, and I'll click Finish. Once you've done that, you've created the data source, all right? Now, if I click away for a second, if you notice, my data grid view is pretty small, right? And what I want to do is kind of expand it so it takes up most of my form. Let's do that. So here it is. I'm expanding the data grid view. Takes up most of my form here. Right, there it is. Now, I still want to modify this because I have a lot of different things going on here. First of all, if I click the Smart tag here, I can choose to I can edit my columns. So under my Smart tag, edit columns, right? Maybe I don't want my ISBN, so I'm going to remove that. I don't care about my subject code for now, or my shelf location, or if it's fiction or not. I don't want to care about that. All I care about is title, author, and publisher for our example, right? So I'm going to select those. And by the way, I'm going to scroll down, because this also shows you these are the properties for these different columns, right? And what I want to do is I want to set a couple things here. My auto size mode, I want to set to none, right? And I want to set the width to 250 pixels, right? And I want to do that for each of them. So here's my author, 250. Auto size mode is none. And title, 250. Auto size mode is none. Now that I've done all that, this is, by the way, I can move them around if I want certain columns to come out first than others. Yes? It's probably your IP address that you have an issue with, right? Are you able to see if you go to from your host machine, can you connect to your virtual machine? Then you should be able to connect with this too. And you can, instead of localhost, put in the IP address. And it doesn't work? Yeah. So it might be an issue with your connection, right? I'll be honest with you. There's something going on because you're using a virtual machine. I'm using my virtual machine. I'm doing everything within my virtual machine, so that's why it's working properly. But typically that should work no problem. And I've done it with services like on another machine, and it works too, right? It doesn't have to be local here. It could be your port that you're using. Check your port. Make sure your MySQL port is running on 3306. All right, check these things out because that might be the reason why you're having a connection problem. I'll come to on the break. I'll come and see you. Okay, so here you've modified your columns. Press OK, and now if you notice, my my data grid view takes up most of my form, and it is if you notice, it only shows one row, of course, because this is an example, a data set example of what it's going to look like. Okay. If I click Start now, right, it's going to pop up on the left, and here's all the data. So it's connecting to my database, right, my MySQL database. Here's the title, the author, and the publisher, and so on. Okay, and I could scroll left or right if I can't see everything. Now my form in this particular case, I've made it so I can make it grow, but unfortunately, my data grid view doesn't grow with it. I can modify that, by the way. But for now, let's leave it the same. Okay, so this is our title, author, and publisher. Obviously, publisher doesn't make any sense for it to be 250. I've made 250 for all of them, right? And this is one of the controls we need to learn. So again, it's created without any coding from you. Okay, it's created 3 components. It's kind of launched here into your component tray, and it does all the work for you. So there is no coding for you to do when it comes to grabbing the data from this data set and creating a data grid view. Right? And by the way, once we have a data source for our project, the data source is there. We don't have to go back later on and redo that data source. If you've already created the data source, or if you've created a link to that data source for your project, it's there. And we're going to try something else now. So keep this project open, and so we don't have to recreate the data source again. Okay. Let's take a look at the code, though. I think it's an important thing to do. So if I right-click on my form, or click and use the View Code option, or F7 to view the code, then you're going to notice that here's my books form load, and on the load event of my books form, it's actually going to fill. It's going to use this fill method of my books table adapter, right, to fill the form with this data set. That's what it's going to do, right? And it says, look, it says to do this line of code loads data into the R&R books data set books table. You can move or remove it as needed. Right? If you remove it, though, it won't work anymore, right? Like your data grid view won't work. You have to put it somewhere. So it doesn't have to appear here at books forms load. You can put it on activation as well, which for your assignment number 4 might be the right thing to do, right? So think about this when it comes to you designing your assignment. The rest of the information is stored, of course, on the design side, right? You can't see what's happening, but it's actually made all the links for your data and everything here. If you notice toolbox is set in, and I've kind of pinned it to my environment here. I also have something else called data sources here on my sidebar. I can click that, and if I click data source, it actually shows me the data source, and it shows me the R&R books data set. And if I actually click this down arrow, it'll show me the different columns that are available for me, or fields, if you will, that are available for me that I can access. Okay. The other thing that you notice is this, and we're going to talk about this later on. All of these fields right now are like text boxes, right, or labels, right? If I click on any one of these fields and use this down arrow, right, it allows me to change the text box to a label, a combo box, a link label, a list box, anything else as well. And we'll try that later on. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a text box. That's just the default when you drag and drop your data grid view on your form. All right? So this is your data set that I'm looking at right now. Let's go back to your toolbox. So we've kind of skipped through this. And I've talked about how to connect. And again, this might be your issue. Somewhere in here, your connection string that you're creating, it's trying to connect you make sure the username and password is correct as well. And depending on the kind of error you're getting, you might have a problem connecting. Localhost may not be the right host name. You may have to put the fully qualified host name in there, and that might work, right? If you're using connected. Did you make it work, by the way? No? Okay, we'll check it out in a second. All right. We've kind of done all this already, so we're going to skip through. So the database schema file kind of looks like this. And you've seen this kind of file before. If you've done any kind of databasing at all, and you have any kind of database manager or management program, you're going to see this. You're going to see a view that looks like this. And you're going to see basically all the fields. And sometimes if you see this key here, right, this is a key field, right? Right? And this, it could be a unique key. Most times it is, right? And it could be auto-generating, depending on the way you've set up your database, right? And you'll have different symbols here depending on the type of key. You might have more than one. For example, if you have another table that links to this one, it might have a foreign key, ISBN, and you might have that somewhere else in a different table as well. And you might see a line that goes from this key to the other one, right? It basically shows you. It's a graphic representation of the relationships of your database. Okay. Let's talk about binding individual data fields. So again, table fields from a data set can be bound to different kinds of controls: labels, text boxes, combo boxes, check boxes, whatever you decide to do. We've done an automatic binding because what we've done is we've used our the data grid view. We've dragged and dropped over. We don't have to do it that way though. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. So this is what we want. This is the result we want. We want to have, this is the database navigator here that we talked about earlier, right? Up here, there's these controls that are automatically generated, by the way, right? And what will happen is you have these controls, and you might have seen this before in some other Microsoft products where you can step through different records, right? Whether it's a database or a text file or any other kind of file. You can actually click the next arrow, and it'll kind of step you through all the fields in the database or file, the next record. So how do we do that? Well, we can do that through the data sources window that I just showed you, right? So again, we would have, if we didn't have this, we'd have to add our new data source, right? And finally, after we step through, we'd have to get to this point again where we select all the fields, and instead of us choosing data grid view, we're going to choose details. So let's do that next. So let's go over here. And if you notice, right now we've got this data grid view here. And if I go to my data sources, if I click on the books itself, right now it shows me the data grid view that I've got here, right? I can choose details, right? So let's do this. Just so we don't screw up this form and see how this form is affected. Let's open a new form. So we're going to go Project, Add Windows Form, right? And this time, this second form that we're going to put together, instead of Books form, it's going to be called, we'll call it Detail Form. So here's Detail Form, right? And Detail Form, we'll change the text property again, so it's R&R Books, just to keep with the theme. And we're going to stretch it out just like we have the other one. A little bit, though. Not as much as before. Here it is, right? Oops. So here's details form, okay? Books form is still there. We haven't touched that. We're going to go to our data sources this time, like it shows us, right? And we notice a couple things. Fiction is actually a yes or no. Is it fiction or not, right? So we should probably change that. If you want to pull down, if you click on fiction and pull down, I probably want to make it some kind of checkbox or something else. So you can click Customize, and it'll give you a list of different kinds of options you can add. So I want to add a checkbox, and this is what I think fiction should be, checkbox, right? Also, like we said before, our data source is right now a data grid view. I want to change the detail view, right? So there's my data source. I'm changing it to data view, to detail view, and you'll see the symbol changes next to books, right? So instead of it looking like this, it'll change to details view like this, okay? And now what I want to do is I want to take all this, right? I can do one of two things. I can take this and drag and drop it onto my form, right? When I do, here it is. I'm going to just drag and drop it over here. A bunch of stuff happens, right? It generates labels and text boxes automatically, right? Labels and text boxes automatically for you, right? And also this books binding navigator up here, right? Which you may want to use or may not want to use, okay? So let's just align these boxes a little bit better because I don't like it. Okay, here we go. And you know what? Just to make more sense, to house all the data, I'm just going to make it so that these boxes expand all the way to the end. Just modify the way the boxes look. So we're creating our new form, right? I know, but I choose to do it this way. And the bottom line, I don't need this label at all, right? This label doesn't make any sense to me because I already have a fiction label right here. So I can just delete the label. Oops. If I can, yeah, which is fine. So there it is. And that's not what I wanted to do. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to delete the label on the checkbox, which is what I did. Okay, good. So now this is good, right? Now this isn't going to run this, right? Because remember, our first form right now, what's running in our database, it's going to be this one. It's going to be books form, right? So we have to change our programs.cs file. So instead of books form, right, we actually want to run details form or detail form, right? Because we don't want to run book form now at all, right? So save everything, start, and here's detail form. And if you notice, I've got the checkbox here running. That looks well, so it's either checked on or off if it's fiction or not. 89 years in the sand trap. That sounds like fiction to me, right? Could not be though. It could be. And if I keep clicking on, right, it's going to be able to. We're using the binding navigator here. You should be able to click through all of the type of books in your database, right? So that's a kind of a built-in functionality as well. I can also do things like add new records to the database if I want to, right? But be careful. Sometimes, depending on your connection and your rights, security rights, and so on, it may not allow you to, right? So if I wanted to click Add New, right, I can create an ISBN, 12345, my title. As an example, maybe it's going to be called Republic of Thieves, one of the books I've read lately, right? Scott Lynch. I would recommend highly that you read this. It's the Gentleman Bastard series. If you're not a gentleman bastard, you should be one. All right, be a gentleman bastard. Yeah, publisher, I'm not sure who it is, and so on. Subject code and shelf location we don't care about. But let's put in some. Let's say it's Dell for the publisher. The subject code. I don't know. Maybe we'll make it SF1. And then shelf location is 513. I don't know. All right, and it's definitely fiction, right? We know it's fiction. Right? If I save my data, if I've done everything correctly, we're all good, right? And if you notice, it went to the last field, this field 34. If I step back, right? Here's the way, and I go forward. Here's my Republic of Thieves, right? I can exit the application. Just to see if it worked, I can go back into my WAMP server here, and I can go into phpMyAdmin, right? And I'll log in with my password. Here's my R&R books, right? And if I look at books, and if I go to books itself, here it is. And if I go all the way to the bottom, and probably on the next page. Here it is, right? So Republic of Thieves, I just added a field to my, and if you notice, it doesn't follow my business rules because I didn't set up any validation for my form, which is something that you'd want to do to make sure it adheres to the rules of all your fields, right? And again, we're not talking databases, but in reality, it should adhere. If you're going to add a new record to the database, it should adhere to the business rules associated with it. Okay. So that kind of proves our connection. All right. Now let's just skip through this. We've already done all this. What was that?
He says when the proof is the proof, if it's,
Don't say proof? All right.
No, don't worry about it. We'll explain later.
All right, no problem. At this stage, I think we're sitting at 11:52, and I'd like to take a brief break.